The only reason I'm doing this is because I've got this thing.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this magnificent space in the Performing Arts Centre of Monash University. Welcome to our academic colleagues, and a particular welcome to people off the street. I like to think that there's a lot of people who are here tonight that have seen the advertisement in the newspaper. My name is Peter Darvall. I'm one of the Deputy Vice-Chancellors at this great university, and it is my privilege on behalf of the Vice-Chancellor to introduce to you tonight Professor Pat Vickers-Rich. And I can tell by the size of the audience that you already know what a star Pat is. This is one of the series of inaugural lectures of new professors in the university. Now, this is not a habit that Monash has always practiced, but it's a very good habit because we like to know about our curious academic leaders, and I mean that they are inquiring people, and we like to know what they are curious about and to rekindle the excitement of what is a university. It may surprise you that Pat Vickers-Rich is a new professor, since she is so well known that you may have thought that she has been one for a very long time. In fact, she has recently been appointed to a personal chair at Monash University, and personal chairs are very hard to obtain. You have to be a particularly distinguished scholar on an international level, and that scholarship is judged almost entirely on research. And Pat passes that criterion. That she happens to be also a prominent businesswoman, fundraiser, director of the Science Centre of Monash University, entrepreneur on an international scale, and tireless promoter is incidental to her great scholarship. But at least you will be able to be exposed to all of these facets tonight, and I think that she's going to put on a bit of a performance. So Pat has achieved the highest standard of scholarship. She is a star, a Monash star, and an international star. I won't describe her curriculum vitae to you because she is going to reveal quite a lot of that and all of the important human parts of that in her speech tonight. Because of this space, she says that she was tempted to sing, but she will resist. The format of the evening is that she will speak for a good long academic time, and at the end of that time, please feel free to ask questions. The first few questions will be fielded from the floor, and they should only be questions which we can all enjoy. If you wish to ask more detailed scientific questions, then please do that later. So it was with great pleasure that I introduce one of our stars, Professor Pat Vickers-Rich.
You've taken my speech. Peter nicked off with my speech. I don't really know how to take all of those compliments that Peter gave me because they're quite undeserved. And anyway, I'm sure I won't live up to what he said tonight, but I'll do my best to take you on a little trip. When I was asked by Professor Logan to give this lecture tonight, I had a long talk to myself about what I should talk about, because he left the field open for me to talk about anything I wanted. And of course, my first my first thought was, well, I'll talk about dinosaurs, but then I realized that everybody's probably heard about my dinosaurs before, so I really can't spend the entire lecture talking about dinosaurs. And then I thought of a little comment that someone had once made to me that had made a very great impression on me, and it had only been a passing comment, so it wasn't, I don't think, made by the person who made it to have any derogatory connotations, but it was the title of my talk, and I thought I would go back to that, and starting with that comment, to take you through a few of the things I've done, all with a definite purpose in mind. And the purpose is to point out a couple of very, very important things to me. And I must say that what I talk about tonight is nobody else's opinion but my opinion. I have talked to many people and they hold similar opinions. But as they say at the beginning of things, all that you will hear is definitely my opinion. I take full responsibility for it. It is not the university's opinion, etc. It's my opinion. It's a personal view. But I don't think there would be too much disagreement amongst many of the colleagues that I work with here or in many other parts of the world. So the statement that we will start with, I'll lead up to it a little bit. I'm going to do something I hardly ever do tonight, and I'm going to look at my notes a bit because I want to be sure that I tell you all I want to tell you. And I will try not to let it drag on much more than about an hour, but if I go maybe 10 minutes beyond the hour, if you feel like getting up and leaving, please do. I won't be offended. So I'll start this, and maybe if I get to feeling a little bit better about all this technical detail I have to deal with before me, I won't read my notes so much, but I will start with them, and we'll go from there. So the paper says here, when I took my first job at Texas Tech University, straight out of graduate school, I went from a beautiful forested eastern America to the flatlands of West Texas. Now I'm told that if I turn that on and I press that button, we should have something happening. We do. Texas Tech was the place that I went to work now. Also, the lights should come up so you won't be in darkness too long. Texas Tech was an oil geologist's paradise. It was a place where if you wanted to dig oil wells and wanted to find oil fields, it was the place to go and be trained. The staff were very well trained sedimentologists and oil field geologists, and so I felt just right at home because I had been living in California for a long time before that in the midst of oil fields, and that was something that made me quite happy. I remember the first night that I went to any kind of an event. Matthew, can we start? There we go. We need the lights up. I went to an event and I was all dressed up in my good duds, drove into a service station, which is a petrol station here, and this nice man came out to fill my pickup truck, which is called a ute, with gas, which is petrol. And he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I work up at the Tech." He says, "What do you teach?" I said, "Geology." And of course he said, "What's a nice girl like you doing in a place like that?" Well, I hadn't really thought about it. Nobody had ever asked me that question before. And I didn't quite know what to think about what he had said. I don't think he meant anything by it. But anyway, he made it clear to me that he thought because I was so young that I shouldn't be teaching in a university. But he really didn't tell me after he had said that and finished filling my pickup truck up with gas what he thought I ought to be doing. So when I got home I went to my function. When I got home that night, I thought to myself, why did that statement startle me so much? Why hadn't anybody ever said that to me before? And why shouldn't I be teaching up at the Tech? What was so unusual about that? And then I got to thinking, well, it's probably all tied up with where I came from, what my background was like, and how I'd gotten to where I was in my late 20s. And so what I want to do tonight is to take you through a little bit of that, but to keep two things in mind. Two things that I think you'll find recurring throughout my little travels I will take you on tonight, and that is two things that are very important to me. One of those is curiosity, and I mean curiosity from the time you're born till the time you die. It's an important aspect of my life, and it's an important aspect of my students' lives, of my parents' lives, and lots of other people's lives who I feel very comfortable with. And a second thing that I think is important is that individuals should be encouraged They may not be able to do it, but they should be encouraged to follow their dreams, to follow something that they really love doing. Not because it's going to make them money, or it's going to be practical, or it's going to be anything, but if they have something that's innately driving them, they should be encouraged to pursue it, at least for a while. And then if it doesn't work, well, then you have to try something else. So those two issues I'd like to look a little bit more at. And I'd like to counterpoint two statements, and then we'll start on our little journey. You're getting tired of me telling you all these philosophical things, I'm sure, and you really want to see some pictures of dinosaurs, and we'll get into that in a minute. One quote is from a presidential speech that was given in 1980 by a person who will remain nameless. But he will remain nameless because I've heard this before. I've heard this elsewhere. I've heard it in many different cultures and in many different parts of the world, so this person shouldn't be entirely blamed for it. And the comment is, why should we subsidize intellectual curiosity? As if it's something that you just don't need to do. It's something that you only do if you have a little bit of spare cash in your pocket. Why should we do it? That was 1980. There's another comment by a man who is a great hero of mine. And I say he is a great hero because I don't know as much history. You can tell by my accent that I wasn't born and raised here. I say this because he was a great hero to me as a child where I was born and raised, and his name's George Washington. And he made a statement in 1790 in one of his speeches to the Congress. And remember, you're dealing with a country that was a pioneering country at that time. It was pretty chaotic at that time in the United States. And this man made the following statement, and I can't agree with him more. There's nothing which can better deserve our patronage than the promotion of science and literature. Knowledge is in every country the surest basis for public happiness. And I counterpoint those two comments, one made in 1980, one made in 1790. And I'd like to go on from there. Now, let's think about, let's get out of Texas. If I can get out of Texas. This is one of my great problems in life. Here's your oil fields. This is your American oil field. And let's go, and I'm sorry for the darkness of this slide, but with the lighting here, we've been doing all kinds of technical machinations, and this is the best we can do. When I was 4 years old is the first time I can remember. Everybody's always trying to remember times before that, but my memory is kind of bad, and I only remember back to when I was 4. And I lived in a place like this. Now, this place that you see here is a big cotton field, and there's some mountains in the back of it. And this was our cotton field. This is where we raised our cotton. I remember being 4. And when I was 4, I had a dollhouse made for me by my uncle, who was very proud of this dollhouse. And he brought it over and he set it up in the backyard, and he expected me to go out there and play with my dolls. But what I did was to go out and gather together all the jars I could get with the lids that screwed on the top of them. And I went out into my dad's fields and my mom's fields, and I collected a lot of insects. Now, my dad thought this was a great idea. It was pest control. So I collected those insects and I took them back into my dollhouse. My uncle was disappointed because he did have some ideas about what girls of age 4 should be doing. And I put them on these little shelves that my dad had built for me. And I tried to classify them. Now, I'm sure that people here at the university would say my classification was a bit strange, but it was a try, and that's what I did. The other thing that I felt very lucky in being able to be a part of was my dad's farm, my dad and mom's farm, because we were there on the ground, we were growing things, we had to produce what we used. Most of the things we used, we produced. And in fact, I remember as a child that my dresses were made, I had beautiful dresses, they were made out of chicken feed sacks. We always went to buy our chicken feed, and when we bought our chicken feed, we picked them out not because of the chicken feed, but because of the pattern on the sack. So we did a lot of things with very little. And I really am glad. I didn't have a choice in this, but I'm glad that I was involved in doing the work and being involved with my parents on that farm. It gave me a good background. I was reading recently, and I brought it along for those of you who haven't seen it, Carl Sagan's latest book called The Demon-Haunted World, which is an excellent book. And since I like Carl Sagan's books, I always get the latest. And in that, I find his childhood was very much like mine in some ways. My dad had very little formal education. In fact, my dad dropped out of school when he was in grade 6, which is just the age our son is now. He had to quit school because he was the oldest in a family of 13, and his dad and mom just kept having kids, and he had to actually drop out of school to help support the kids. So he dropped out of school, and he didn't have a lot of formal training. My mom, on the other hand, did at least have a high school degree, and she was very, very good at mathematics. She went on and got an accountancy certification. She wanted to go to college badly, but her father offered a college education to the 2 boys in the family, but he refused to let her go. So that wasn't too keen. Anyway, that didn't seem to bother her too much. And my parents were married, and they raised me on this farm. They taught me 2 things that were very, very important. One of those was clear thinking was important, and practicality was important. And I guess a third thing was that if you worked really hard, it usually resulted in something positive. And those values were instilled in my mind very, very early, and they were instilled practically on that farm. Obviously, if you didn't do a good job and you didn't work hard, you weren't going to grow any cotton. And so it was pretty obvious that you had to do that. Now, I found when I was reading Carl Sagan's book that he mentions the same thing about his parents. He says in one part of the book, they knew almost nothing about science, his parents. But in introducing me simultaneously to both skepticism and to wonder, they taught me the 2 uneasily cohabiting modes of thought that are central to scientific thinking. And I think that could be extended to just simply clear thinking. It doesn't have to be labeled scientific. It's just plain clear thinking that every individual in this world should be able to utilize very well and to their advantage. Further, Sagan says in his book, and this rings true with me, his parents were only 1 step out of poverty, but when he announced to them that he wanted to be, in his case, an astronomer, and when I announced at age 8 that I thought I really would like to be either a nuclear physicist or a brain surgeon, now those 2 things are a little bit far apart, but to an 8-year-old, there's probably not a whole lot of difference. They didn't say, oh, come off of it, kid, you can't do that, or how about going out and being an accountant, or why don't you do something that might make a lot of money, or something like that. They never said that to me. They never implied that to me. They never ever gave me that impression. So that's the background I came from. The one final thing that my parents gave to me, which I treasure, and which I think isn't always there, is that my parents gave me the feeling that my opinions were worth something, even as an 8-year-old. I always felt that I had some kind of input into the decisions in the family, that was an important aspect. So I valued my own opinion, and that was something that I have found in my own life when times get really tough, that it's a very useful trait to have. It's something it's a gift that they gave me that makes things very important. Now this really came out and was impressed in my mind, their support of me, their belief, in a way, in me, of making decisions that were good for me, when it came time for me to move away to college. I didn't think anything unusual about me going to college. There'd never been anyone in my family for 14 million generations back that had ever gone to university. It was something that wasn't done. But I never even thought that it wasn't something I shouldn't do if that's what I wanted to do. And when it came time for us to move away to university, which we did, my parents had to sell everything they owned and move away with me. We went up to Berkeley in the Berkeley Hills. We rented a house after having sold the house that we owned. We got an old bomb of a car that we all shared, and we all went to work. And that's how I went to college. Fortunately, university didn't cost like it does today, but we went, and that's how they handled the situation. And I take my hat off to them. They really must have believed I was doing something that was important to do that kind of thing with their lives. Now, my education. I've divided the following little journey up into a few categories, and what I'd like to do is look at my education, the primary and secondary and the tertiary. I'll try not to drag this too far out because it's really time to get on to some more pictures. But I want to just look at a little bit of it. Primary education was in California. California is a wonderful, beautiful place. It's got too many people in it right now, but it's a beautiful place. And when I look back on my primary and secondary education, I realize how very, 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 very lucky I was. Because this was in the 1950s, and 1960s, beginning in the late 1940s and 1950s and then into the 60s. I was born right at the end of World War II. And so people were coming back from the war, those who hadn't gotten left in the fields of France or someplace. And those who came home were very glad to be home. There was a real hopefulness in people at that time. Lots of people going back to school that had never finished school. There was plenty of work around for anybody that wanted work. There was a real feeling of prosperity amongst people. The schools in California at that time, at least in the place where I live, which is the Central Valley of California, San Joaquin, a very, very rich agricultural valley, were absolutely stunning. They were state schools. They were the best of any schools we have in this country and the best of any that I've seen in the United States in primary and secondary. They were a reasonable size. They had reasonable sized classes. Most of my classes would have had maybe 19 to 23 kids. They had absolutely excellent teachers. I can only remember one teacher in all of the teachers that I had from the time I started school in kindergarten till the time I got out of university that I would say wasn't really an exceptional teacher. So I had no lack of good teachers. The schools were small, they were local, they were stable. You could expect to see the same teachers teaching the next year you came back that you saw the previous year. So there was stability all the way through them. These were state-supported schools. Our taxes paid for those schools. Those schools had all kinds of extracurricular activities in them. We had, even in primary school, we had orchestras, we had bands, we had all kinds of sporting events and so forth that were organized by the school itself. We didn't have to do this outside. It was all part of the schools. As the years went by, those schools became involved in activities that were going on around the world, and that was a space race. I remember very clearly when Sputnik went up and the space race between the U.S. and the Soviets, that had a great impact on science in California schools, and I presume schools everywhere else. My fellow students and I were all aware of this. And keep in mind that my school was not in Berkeley, it was in Visalia, which is a little tiny town in the middle of an agricultural community. So these were kids that were coming off the farms, kids coming out of a small urban population, a town that would have had no more than about 15,000 in it, but it wasn't a place that was associated with a university or anything like that. And we were very excited about science. We were excited about what was going on in science, and scientists were looked up to. Science teachers were looked up to. They were just as important as the sports teacher or any other kind of teacher. They had the same sort of status that other teachers had, and I find very often this is not the case now. We had heroes, and I remember talking about my heroes in grade 5 and grade 6 of people like E.O. Lawrence, Albert Einstein, Marie Curie, people like that. And later on when I was in high school, Crick and Watson, the people who did the early work on DNA, those were heroes. Those were heroes just as much as the baseball heroes and the football heroes. They were all there. They were all part of our heroes. While I lived in California, I was also fortunate. As I said, California is an absolutely beautiful place. Coastal areas like that, beautiful granite mountains, the Sierra Nevadas. My parents and I, although we didn't have a whole lot of money, we went to those places and we camped and we fished and we got to know those places, the redwoods up in the Sierra Nevadas. We spent every Easter up there having an Easter picnic. It was a great thing we looked forward to. So I was just overwhelmed by the biodiversity of this region, and I loved taking photographs. I must admit, I didn't take this when I was 9. I look back at my photographs at age 9, and I didn't really think you wanted to see them. So I got another photograph. But this was all around me. So I lived on a farm. I had all this wonderful biodiversity. How else could you not be curious about things like this? I think I'll go back here. So there we are. A couple of last things that I can remember when I was a child that really, really influenced me was my paternal grandmother, who lived to be about 100 million years old. She'd actually died at about 85. And that woman planted a garden every day, every year, until she died. She had a wonderful garden growing when she died. And she taught me something that I still do firmly believe. You need to plant a garden every year. I don't care whether it's a foot square or it's a huge field. It keeps some kind of context in your life about production and you understand the fact that you just don't go to the supermarket and buy the corn, it has to grow someplace, and that climate and the vagaries of what's going on in the atmosphere of this earth can have an effect on production. So that's something that is important to me, and it's important to my daughter, and I hope it goes on for generations. The other thing that was important to me, too, and it is still very important to me, as you heard from the music that I was playing at the beginning of this session, I'm part Cherokee. My grandfather was Cherokee, and so having that native background, the Native American background, was something I treasured and valued, and the music that we heard was music of that sort. So those things are my background, and those things make me tick. I went on to Berkeley, and when I went to Berkeley, it was absolutely fabulous. It was a mind blower. I thought I'd had a good time in primary school and secondary school, but when I got to Berkeley, I found that I was dealing with real scientists that I'd only heard of. Berkeley was overwhelming, though. When I went to Berkeley, I went from a high school that had 300 in it. That was really big to me in this little country town that I lived in. And when I got to Berkeley, there were 30,000 students there. That's about the size, I gather, of what all the campuses of Monash put together would make. But this was in one place. And I got there, and I just kind of looked around, and I thought, whoa, what have we here? Well, what we had there at a place that we fondly called Berkeley was a collection of wonderful, wonderful people, many of them Nobel laureates. And they treated us just like we were like them. We had I had Melvin Calvin as a second-year lecturer. He was a man who did a lot of things in organic chemistry. My husband had Louis Alvarez as his physics teacher. These people were just there, and they had their doors open, and you could go in and talk to them. And that was just fantastic. I had already had some contact with people like that because as a high school student, I decided to do a project on radiocarbon dating. And so I decided, well, I'll just write to Willard Libby and ask him if I can get some information from him. He was at UCLA, and I did. I still have the letters there in my little box that I keep. And he said, come down and see me. We'll be glad to talk to you. So I went down and saw him, and he gave me some things I needed to use in I built a little radiocarbon dating machine, which didn't work very well, but at least it had all the bits. We went to the National Science Fair with it. But I had that contact with him. Again, he took me seriously. He didn't say, you know, get lost. And that was important. And that's what I found at Berkeley. So that was quite a mind blower. The thing that frightened me at first was the fact that when we went in first year, we were told half of us wouldn't be there in second year, and that was the truth. So we worked very hard, and it was pretty strenuous at that stage to get into second year. But there was just so much going on there that you rather didn't even think about the work at that time. One way I alleviated my tensions when I went to Berkeley was I looked at this university with its 30,000 students, and I said, this is really big. Is there a place that's smaller in this university? I was a pre-med student at that time. I was still trying to be the brain surgeon, but I decided I really liked the outdoors, so maybe being a brain surgeon wasn't a good place to have my, do my operations. So I was thinking about other things at this stage and had collected fossils just as a hobby when I was a kid. And I noticed in the Berkeley handbook that there was a department of paleontology. I thought, this sounds interesting. I might wander over there and just see what's going on. So I wandered over to the Department of Paleontology, not vertebrates, but just everything, invertebrates and plants, and I found out that they had 10 undergraduate students. This sounded like a place for me. I thought, boy, this is great. There were 12 professors, there were 25 graduate students, and there were 10 undergraduates. So, you can guess where I went. And it was, again, fantastic because the graduate students spent a lot of time with us. We spent a lot of time with the graduate students. And the most important thing, well, there's two most important things. One of them was that I met Reuben Arthur Sturton, who's the man here on the right. He did a great deal, and I can't go into the details of it. He did a great deal of work here in Australia on things that I'm interested in, vertebrate animals. And he really opened up the record of those animals back beyond just the last couple of million years. So he was there at Berkeley. And the other thing that was important at Berkeley was that we did a lot of field work. And I still believe that field work is where you really end up learning what you learn best. You put the theory that you learn in the classroom into practice. And so that was great. And there is a third most important thing. I met my husband there. And so we got up to a lot of paleontological mischief after that. So there was a lot of things coming from Berkeley. A fourth most important thing that I learned at Berkeley is that science wasn't the only thing that was interesting. I already knew that. Science, to me, was what I had a passion for. But I also had a passion for music, and I won't sing. But I also had a passion for rowboating and for sailing and for dancing and for doing a lot of things. And Berkeley offered all these. I had all kinds of teachers there. I took courses in logic, in theology, in music, in history, even in the performing arts when I was at Berkeley. And because my degree, my undergraduate degree, is an AB, a Bachelor of Arts, I was allowed to do this. And in fact, in the American system, that's what you do. You don't do a science degree as an undergraduate. It's part of the curriculum, unless it's changed since I was there and was a student. So I did all that. This diversity was great. And so it worries me when I hear in the current winds of change that we want to perhaps get rid of some of this diversity in universities, not only here in Australia, but around the world. That diversity, to me, is absolutely fundamental to allowing people to think straight. You need to know what somebody else is doing and something about what they're doing in order to understand them. So this diversity was very important to me. Well, Sturton was there at Berkeley. I began working under him on a project on Australian fossils, and most unfortunately, Sturton died of a heart attack about a year after I started working under him. I finished my undergraduate degree at Berkeley and then went to Columbia. Now, Columbia was an interesting decision because Tom, my husband, and I had to make a decision where we were going to graduate school after Berkeley because we had to go one place. We didn't really want him one place and me someplace else. So I really had a person at the University of Florida that I wanted to go and study under, and he had a person at Columbia who he wanted to study under. Now, he didn't just set his foot down and say, we're going to Columbia, but we looked at the people that we wanted to study under, and we decided who was the best. And we decided to go to Columbia, and that was the most fortuitous decision that we ever made, because when we went to Columbia, we got right into the middle of a wonderful paradigm shift. Columbia was a hotbed of ferment dealing with the plate tectonics debate and moving continents. That was just at the time. You could not have been a graduate student at a better time than this. This was a major revolution going on in the geological sciences. I remember when I was at Berkeley, and I was studying under an invertebrate paleontologist called J. Wyatt Durham, who I had the greatest respect for. And the graduate students got him a present at Christmas. And the present they got him at Christmas was a little plastic bowl, and in it were some styrofoam continents. And they gave it to him, and they said, now, Wyatt, you can move your continents wherever you want to move them. And they clearly didn't think very highly of his moving his continents. But when we went to Berkeley, when we went to Columbia, we found there were a lot of people there that were making quite a bit of progress on this new idea movement. It wasn't a new idea, but an idea that was being debated at the time. And we as graduate students were right in the middle of that debate. Columbia, at that time, had many, many bits. We were in the geology department at the main campus, which I just showed you there. But most of our work was done at the American Museum, which was associated with Columbia. That main campus was also associated with Lamont Dougherty Research Labs, which were up the Hudson, and that's where most of the oceanographic work was being done by the Columbia scientists were involved in. Now, the graduate students from Columbia, the American Museum, Lamont Dougherty, had seminars together. We all got together we all argued, and we could argue with each other. At this stage, it was such an early stage in the settling of this debate that you felt you could argue just as well as anybody else could. And so you could tell them about what you were working on, they could tell you what they were working on. Now, what they were doing at that time, which was very, very fortuitous for Tom and I, because we were studying for our horrific oral exams, which most students in this country do not have to face. We went into graduate school, you were given a couple of years to really, really, really get to know your subject, and then you were marched into a room at gunpoint, not really, but you felt like it. And you were sat at the head of a very large table, and you had 5 people examine you for about 2 hours. And if you couldn't answer their questions to their satisfaction, you were marched out and given your walking papers. This wasn't just a play exam. It was a very serious exam. And so you had the opportunity to study for this for 2 years. Now, what made this exam a lot easier for us was that when we first came to Columbia, there was all this information that was out there that we had to learn about, such as where are the volcanoes, where are the earthquakes, where are all these geological features, and you just sort of sat down and you memorized this. But what plate tectonic theory did for us was to amalgamate all that information into one theory that explained why they were where they were, such as volcanoes and earthquakes, and you could predict where they were going to be. Now, what they were doing at Lamont, as this little diagram and some of the ones I'll show you just alludes to, is that they were people like Bruce Hazen and Marie Tharp were mapping, along with a lot of other people, mapping the topography of the ocean basins. Now, prior to their work, ocean basins, if you look at a National Geographic map of about 1940, early 1950s, you'll find that they're pretty flat. But if you look at a map that was made a little later than that, in the early 60s, you begin to see that there are ridges and there are trenches. And this map is a little bit arty, so that it doesn't show them in great detail, but you can see there is a ridge coming down here, and there are trenches over here. Most of you in the audience have at least had some introduction to those. But those were being mapped in the 60s when we got to Columbia and being plotted up. And I remember going into Bruce Hazen's office, and he had, it was just scattered with maps everywhere with the latest data that was coming in from a lot of the Lamont ships that were going back and forth across the ocean basins. Other people were trying to figure out where, this is American Museum, that's where we were. They were trying to figure out where the animals were when all these continents were dashing around, but we won't go into that. Other people were mapping, for instance, where earthquakes were. I remember Le Pichon, again, going into his office and looking at some of the seismic profiles that he was getting. And they were not only mapping where the earthquakes occurred, but as you can see from the color on those dots, they were mapping how shallow and how deep those earthquakes were. And that was critical to helping understand how this plate tectonic theory that was later proposed worked. People were mapping where volcanoes occurred. And there again, you can see where active volcanoes occur. So in the end, what happened, and another thing they were doing is they began a program while we were at Columbia, slightly before, called the Joides expeditions, which went out into the ocean basin and drilled a lot of holes. And what they were able to establish was that the ocean basins at that time were no older than about 80 to 90 million. That's been extended a bit now, but when we were graduate students, the oldest sediments that they could find were about 80 or 90 million, which said, these ocean basins have not been around forever. And they found also that the age of the sediments in those ocean basins were youngest near the place where the volcanic activity and the earthquakes were occurring in some of these mid-ocean ridges. And they got older and older and older as you moved away from those centers. So all of that information was coming in, and the end result was plate tectonic theory. The idea that the Earth's crust, the upper 100K or so, is a rigid kind of material called the lithosphere, and that is divided into a series of plates, which I forgot to put in, so we'll go back. I apologize for that. Into a series of plates that themselves move or converge. They move apart or they converge with one another along those boundaries. And that's how it works. And the continents are simply part of those plates, and the continents themselves move as a result of the dynamic relations, the dynamic liaisons between those big plates. Now, all of that was happening while we were at Columbia. And to me, it was, again, absolutely mind-blowing that you were right in the middle of this big scientific theory that was being challenged and being replaced. So that was very important to us. Now, in the midst of all this, I still remember that Professor Sturt had given me a problem to solve, and that was what my PhD was about. And my problem that he gave me was to try understanding the relationships between a bunch of big birds that were just uncovered not very long ago by him, and some that had been uncovered in the late 1800s by some people at the South Australian Museum. Nobody knew what these birds were related to. This is an egg that at that time was thought to belong to one of these big birds that was found on the West Australian coast. That egg has since turned out to belong to a bird that lived in Madagascar. And I won't go into the details of how it got to the West Australian coast, but that's another lecture. Anyway, there were remains of this bird group that I was working on from Lake Calabana and from a lot of places in Australia. Now you may think the bird isn't very big, but in this illustration that we have here, the large goanna that's chasing the bird happens to be 25 feet long, 7 meters, something like that. So that's a good scale for you. The birds I was working on were very large, and they weren't emus or cassowaries or anything like that. When you got down to the fine detail of their bones, which again I will not go into, but if anyone's interested I'd be happy to regale you with the detail. When you got to the fine detail, you found they were very, very different than emus and cassowaries. They were a group of birds called the dromornithids that lived in Australia only, and we had, and we still have no idea exactly what group they came from. Now that was the first problem I ran into, but then, being me, I wanted to ask some more questions about this. Where did these birds come from? Where did Australia's birds come from? Where did this wonderful, beautiful avifauna that I was hit full frontal on when I came to Australia, where did it come from? It was so different than any other avifauna I had ever known, and I knew the North American avifauna pretty well. Where did it come from? How did it develop? And so I started reading in the biogeographic literature about the origin of this avifauna, and found that lots of people had talked about it, lots of people had thought about it, far back as Wallace, A.R. Wallace, and Darwin, and people like that. This is a drawing out of one of Wallace's books written in the 1800s, the Australian avifauna. In contrast, and that's one of my favorite pictures of the Australian avifauna, lots and lots of parrots, but in contrast to the Southeast Asian avifauna, which was very, very different. So those two avifaunas that are so closely juxtaposed were very different. Why? How in the world do you get that kind of difference? And I began asking that as I was doing my thesis, and this became a major part of my thesis. I ended up describing all of these hundreds and hundreds of bones of the big birds and tried to figure out who they were related to, came up with an idea, but I was also fascinated by where did it all come from. And I found that a paper, ironically, written on my birthday, not just on the day not just on the, July the 11th, but on the day I was actually born, by Ernst Mayr, called The Birds of Timor and Sumba, was the first bit of literature I had to really rip into, because what I found was that he was writing, quite rightfully, in a different kind of world. He was writing in a stabilist world, and so he was trying to explain the origin of the Australasian avifauna by keeping continents where they were right now. I had come into another world where continents were moving, and so there were other explanations coming to my mind as to how the Australasian avifauna could have come about. And so what I did when I was at Columbia was to look at this question. This is the line that divides the Asian on the left and the Australasian on the right. Avifaunas, it's over a very short geographic area, but it's very, very distinct. I ended up working on that and coming up with some other suggestions. They're hypotheses, but there are other suggestions that fit better with the mobile continent concept, and that was that, yes, Australia has been isolated for a long time, and the isolation that it has had does explain a lot of the differences we see, but Australia has had other connections in the past. It has been connected in the past, say 100 million years ago, with Gondwana, and there are many elements in the avifauna that are Gondwanan in origin, and then Australia had a very separate, it broke away from Gondwana and drifted up towards Asia. It was very isolated. It had another part of its history, and then very recently it's come into contact with Southeast Asia, and the birds have begun interchanging between those two areas. So there are really 3 different periods of time that the Australian avifauna has been affected by, and those bits fit into its history. So that ended up what I wrote about. It ended up, I described the birds that Sturton had given me, but I also was more interested in this very general idea that we were looking at. That was the thesis. Then, as I was doing that thesis, a couple of things happened. I found, after looking at these continents moving and looking at the birds moving, that I really didn't think I knew enough about Australia to write a thesis about it unless I saw it. And fortunately, I was given a chance to come to Australia with a joint American Museum South Australian Museum, Queensland Museum expedition that came here in 1971, and its main purpose was to find more fossil fuels. We went out and checked out lots and lots of different areas that hadn't been looked at before. This is a very young, for those of you in the audience who know Tom and I, it's a very young Tom without a beard on the left-hand side. Richard Tedford from the American Museum, and Rod Wells, who's a very well-known vertebrate paleontologist from South Australia, getting ready to go off into the field. And we did find lots of fossil fuels on that trip. But the thing I got very acquainted with on that trip, which lasted for nearly 5 months, 4 months, something like that, was the environments in Australia, a range of environments that existed on this continent. And that was very important to me, if I'm going to write about it, how in the world can you write about something that you haven't got your teeth into and haven't got the sand in your ears from and things like that? You really have to go out and do something with these environments. And the other thing that became very apparent to me was that what I was seeing now was not at all what the fossils were telling me existed not so long ago in the past. The previous scene is what the area in northern South Australia looks like now. And this scene is what northern South Australia probably looked like about 30 million years ago. Now again, I cannot go through all the thought processes involved here, but this is based on information on vertebrate fossils, on palaeontology, on sediments, on temperatures, on all kinds of things, clay mineralogy. All of these things point to the fact that Central Australia is very, very much drier now than it was 30 million years ago. In fact, 20, 30 million years ago, and as recently as 2 or 3 million years ago, we had beautiful flamingo faunas, avifaunas in Central Australia. And only when the climate became so variable and so unpredictable as it is today, do we lose those beautiful birds that I would have loved to have seen out there. So this is what was happening. We noticed that in the fossils we were finding, and people had found these fossils before, but this kind of a view of Australia was really beginning to emerge as we were working at that time. It was there before, but it was certainly being accentuated now. And it results from Australia having once been, and I'll tell you about a time of that when we talk about the dinosaurs, once been much further south in much wetter latitudes, much wetter situation, and moving northwards into the horse latitudes, into the drier latitudes, and the center of Australia drying out. That not only happened in Australia, but it also happened in places like Africa and North America with the general climatic change that happened in the last 40 or 50 million years. But the northward movement of Australia made it even a more severe change than it was noticed in some of these other places. The other thing I noticed when I was at Columbia was that, and doing my thesis, I wanted to know about the environments from which the fossils were coming that I was working on, but I also felt a great lack of knowledge of ecology, which if I'm going to talk about past paleoecologies, I needed to know. And I thought to myself, again, here's this business of lateral thinking, which you really need to have a good course in, or you just need to really try using. And you get that with curiosity. What can I do to make this better? And so I noticed that the Organization for Tropical Studies was offering a course in Central America for 20 graduate students in America, and you should apply if you wanted to apply. And I thought, the chances of getting into that course are probably pretty slim, but I'm a vertebrate paleontologist, and I'll bet there's been very few vertebrate paleontologists ever applied to go on this course. So I thought, right, I'm going to try. So I tried. That's my parents. They would have told me to try. So I tried and I got on it, and I went to Costa Rica. And I spent 2 months in Costa Rica with a group of people that were looking at modern ecology. And unfortunately, I'm sorry that slide is so dark, but Costa Rica, again, is a fantastic place. And that's our mode of transport. We had to be very laterally thinking about how we were going to get around in the country. And I found that you could rent horses very cheaply. This horse I rented for a week for a bottle of port. And it was not a problem. The horse was good, and we got to where we had to go. Costa Rica was fabulous because it was a new place. It hadn't been there for a long time, and there was lots of volcanic activity, and I was a geologist really at heart, so I was able to look at a lot of volcanic processes while I was there, but what I was really interested in was looking at the rainforest. This is highland second growth rainforest up in the top of the backbone of Costa Rica. And again, I'm sorry about the slides, but they're just the diversity, the biodiversity in this place was absolutely fantastic and mind-blowing. And I was there with a group of people who were primarily ecologists. What we studied was quite varied. we looked for 1 week. I sat and I looked at an acacia, and I watched what the ants did to protect the growing tips of an acacia bush. And I saw that the acacia bush provided a thorn that the ants lived in, and they all got along very well. So this was an interesting thing. Another more gruesome thing that I did, but I was interested in this as a paleontologist, is what happens to bones, to animals when they die, and their bones get exposed and deposited. And so I found a dead horse, and I sat by this dead horse for about, not right by the dead horse, but a little ways away from the dead horse for a week. And you would be amazed at what happened to this dead horse. This dead horse was only a skeleton at the end of the week. It was visited by a whole bunch of different kinds of vultures. There was a real hierarchy to the way those vultures came in and how they located that carcass, and the flies and the maggots and everything else that went along with it degraded that carcass and left it there as a pile of bones by the end of the week. I took careful notes on it, and I published a little paper on it. But I then could understand a little bit better how to interpret my fossils. And of course, there have been lots of studies done like that, but to do one yourself and to see what happens yourself is very important. But another thing that I did that really almost changed my whole life was I was wandering through the woods one day after I'd gotten off my port horse, and I noticed there were some plants that had little red spots on the leaves. Now, these were really big leaves. They were leaves about like that. And I thought, what in the world are those red spots doing on those leaves? And I noticed there were other leaves of the same plant, which is a gesneriad, Columnia florida, that didn't have those leaves, didn't have those spots. And I noticed there were other leaves that had those spots, but those spots were really faded. And so I just sat down by those plants for about a day, and I watched what happened. And the first thing that happened after about 12 hours, and I'd been sitting there waiting for something to happen, was this little hummingbird came in, and it looked at the little leaves, and it dipped in underneath the leaves, and then it stayed under there for a little while, and it dipped out and left. And I thought, what's under those leaves? What's under those leaves? Well, I went over there, of course, and pulled the leaves apart, and there was a beautiful little flower under there with a very, very long part to it, and then the opening, and I noticed that there was a little bit of pollen scattered around on that particular flower. So I said, yeah, I have an idea what's going on here. What's going on here, we're living in a very wet climate. I mean, this took a little while to figure out. I didn't just say, yeah, that's what's happening here, but I sort of worked on it. And what I came up with was this hummingbird had noticed that that plant was there because the leaves had the little red spots, and that was a cue to him or her to go in underneath there because there was something worthwhile. There was a flower that was producing lots of nectar. That flower, it was very worthwhile for that bird to go there because it deposited the pollen right on the top of the bird's head, and when the bird went to the next flower, it pollinated the flower. Now, why so complicated? Complicated because we're in a wet environment. Complicated because if flowers have pollen exposed and it's in a wet environment, it gets washed away and then it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. How that evolved was left for someone else to work on. But the fact that I was the first one that had ever noticed that little association and that it really was neat. I thought, gee, maybe I should be a pollination biologist. Maybe, and I seriously considered this for a while, but then I decided, well, you know, it might have implications in my marriage, it might have all sorts of problems. So I decided, no, I'm not going to pursue that, but just making those associations were really, really important. And making those associations, not just for that instance, but for all kinds of other things, has been something that's excited me for a very long time. So anyway, I came back and I finished up my work, and then it came time to look for a job, and we started down the job track not so long ago. I'm going to go on for about 10 more minutes after the 9 o'clock. Is that going to be all right with you guys? I hope so. I'll try not to bore you. Anyway, got the job, got a Fulbright, came back to Australia because, as I said, Tom and I really didn't think we'd spend enough time in Australia, and if I can figure out how to do this thing here, I will show you what we got involved in when we came back to Australia. And I don't know what I'm doing here. Play. It should work. Matthew, where is it? There it is. We came back to Australia and continued doing the things that we had done. We're going to have to forget the fact that we've come in at almost the end of this sequence, but we were working on getting fossils out of Central Australia. And these are some of the casts that we got. And I will just have to go and end at that sequence. We didn't rewind it where it should have been, so we'll stop it there. It's just my technical inability here. You'll just have to forgive me. We came back to Australia. We continued a lot of the work that we'd been doing. And that was great. We kept looking for more and more fossils. We were really interested in just looking for birds and mammals. Tom was a mammologist, I was a birdologist, and that's what we wanted to do. We kept looking, we kept looking, we kept running up against a brick wall. The brick wall was about 40 million years ago, and we couldn't get fossils that were older than that that could give us a hint at where the birds had originated and where the mammals had originated. There were nice kangaroos and nice emus and nice normornithids about 30, 40 million years ago, but where their ancestors were or things related to them in the past, we couldn't find out. So we decided we're going to change tack, and we're going to go and look for some other things. A little older. Maybe we can get really far down and kind of come up from the bottom instead of coming down from the top. And so we began our work looking for Cretaceous mammals and birds. Now, Cretaceous is a word that many of you don't know, but I'll bet you all know the Jurassic. And the Jurassic is the time just before the Cretaceous. So now you've learned a new word. Cretaceous is the time from about 140 million to 65 million years ago. So we started looking at Cretaceous, and we looked in Queensland, and we looked along the south coast of Victoria, and we found a few things. We didn't find very much, but I remember one day that was very important when one of my graduate students, Tim Flannery, and his cousin, John Long, and Rob Glennie, who's a geologist and had been an old friend of ours, and all three of those people were probably very important. They were very important in keeping Tom and I here when we came back and decided that we might stay, and we couldn't decide whether we were going to stay. Anyway, these three blokes came into our living room, and they had something from down around Inverloch that they had found in a blinding rainstorm. And what they had found down in Inverloch in a blinding rainstorm was the first bone of anything that had been found down there, any terrestrial vertebrate that had been found down there since the claw on the bottom of this slide, which is a dinosaur claw, had been found in the late 1800s. And the bone that they found looked something like this. Now that was pretty exciting because we thought that maybe the guy who found the bones in the late 1800s had just found them and that was it, that's all there were. But Tim started finding more, and Tim, who now is the curator of mammalogy at the Australian Museum and has just written a very fantastic, well, not just, 2 or 3 years ago, wrote The Future Eaters, which is a book that has gained wide acclaim about environmental degradation on a world scale. He kept at this, and we started getting at it, and we ended up developing the fossil field that many of you probably know about, and I do have a video of that, which I'll show you in just a moment. Now, the fossils that we prepared from there take a great deal of effort. First of all, let's just take a look again, and I know this will work, at what the effort has been to get those fossils out. They're right here in the backyard, in your backyard. They are, it takes about 2 or 3 seconds, and this will come up. This is one of the areas that we worked. Many people in this audience know this. It's Dinosaur Cove, and it is a challenging place to work. We have got Tom working really well here, but many of us have taken turns with this jackhammer that's going, or this rock breaker that's going down with him. The work that we've done in Dinosaur Cove and along the southern coast of Victoria has been primarily supported by private industry. Dinosaur Cove was the area we found the most material from up until recently, and this map will show you just what the world looked like at the time that the Dinosaur Cove sediments were being deposited. We're getting there, we're getting there. Australia's way far south. Australia is south of the Antarctic Circle, and it's hooked very nicely onto Antarctica and probably had connections with South America. Now, working this site, as I said, was primarily supported by private industry and the National Geographic Society, and it was a good thing they did because it was a darn difficult site to work. This is easy stuff here in comparison to what went on. I noticed that Alistair Blakey is here in the audience. He was one of our blasting experts that was a volunteer. You can see we finally resorted to gelignite. We dug tunnels into the cliffs there following an old stream, several old stream channels that had bones. We did a bit of blasting, and we recovered 2 partial skeletons plus a lot of other bones that are the only skeletons that we have here from Victoria, and 2 of about 8 skeletons of dinosaurs that we have. This was hard work. It was work that was done with more than 500 volunteers of all sorts and kinds. There goes Nick with his load of rubbish. This was rubbish that had to come out before we got down to the pay dirt. and then the pay dirt had to be gone through by many people just sitting there like the people we transported out here in the beginning to get the small bones out. Sometimes we were lucky and we could take things out like that. That was very rare. Most of the time, things had to go out of that cove either on somebody's back or by a wonderful flying fox that one of our volunteers, John Herman, had rigged up for us. It only broke twice, and no one was hurt. But these sediments, which are old floodplain and river channel sediments, have those wonderful bones in them, and it's taken 15 years now to get that material out of those rocks, and we don't have all of them out yet. You can see there's also another problem that we have because most of our sites are right at sea level and they can only be worked at sometimes, but the fact that they are at sea level is important because that is our greatest friend in eroding these sediments and exposing the bones. Now, one specimen that we had that really was interesting was a partial skeleton of something we called Palaeontology after our daughter. And we had, she deserved it, I'll tell you, with parents like us. The skull has an interesting feature. It had the endocast of the brain, and the red bits on the back are the optic lobes. There were impressions of that left. The eyes on this little dinosaur were really quite huge. And we noted the correlation between the high latitudes of these dinosaurs and the very large optic lobes, which process light, and the very large eyes. This is maybe what Palaeontology saw when she was walking, or there must have been Palaeontology too, but when they were walking through the woods. And they would have had that kind of a light situation for at least 3 months of the year because, of course, you're below the Antarctic Circle. And light would have been precious at those times of the year. So that is where we had gotten to with the Dinosaur Cove. Dinosaur Cove has been something that has taken a lot of work on a lot of people's part with very minor funding from places like the ARC, but from lots and lots of funding from National Geographic and private enterprise. There's probably more than $2 to $3 million been put into that project, either in kind or in actual cash support, and we have the greatest gratefulness to all those who supported. If you had to add up the time that people put in and give them a salary for that, it would be impossible because there were well over 500 people involved in volunteer work doing that. So Dinosaur Cove material came back in. It had to be prepared. Leslie Kuhl is our head preparator, and she had to be trained to do this. You can't just go out and pick someone off the street and train them to do this overnight. So this is a person that we have found absolutely critical to getting this material out and absolutely necessary to find support for to keep this going. Why is it worthwhile even bothering about supporting this kind of an excavation? Well, one of the reasons that we feel that it is because this particular area is very unusual relative to other areas of the world. It's really the only high-latitude vertebrate fauna that we have from this time that has a great deal of diversity in it. There are other places, as you can see on this map, that have places where dinosaurs have been found at Antarctic latitudes, but those places have produced very few, and even though maybe more than a couple or three species, very few as far as biomass of bones from them. The thing that's interesting about the Dinosaur Cove site and this whole southern Victorian area is that it is an environment that has got no modern counterparts. High latitudes, terrifically large and diverse forests, low but not excessively low temperatures, polar dinosaurs, which lots of people are interested in. But it's an environment that may have had a couple of very special characteristics in that it may have spawned diversity and it may have protected the continuance of some groups of organisms well beyond the time they lived elsewhere. The groups that we've been particularly interested, that's what the forest would have looked like, and the groups that lived in that forest we're interested in. I might say that if any of you ever have, if you've not been, many of you in this audience have been, but if you've not been down to areas like Inverloch, you can actually go and walk on the shore platforms and see the remains of the trunks of these giant trees out there once you know what you're looking at. But that forest was very diverse. It was mainly evergreens. The flowering plants were just very tiny, little ground-hugging plants at that time. There were no eucalypts. There were no acacias at this stage. It was a very different kind of forest. The kinds of animals that we're particularly interested in new innovation are things like Tamimus, which is an ornithomimosaur, a little ostrich-like dinosaur. And the reason we're interested in that is because it occurs much earlier here in the southern hemisphere than it does in the northern hemisphere, where it's much better known. And it looks like those kinds of dinosaurs may have gotten their start in these high latitudes. Another interesting beastie, and I have some of these things up on the front table for you to look at, is a big crocodile-like amphibian. Now this thing, its jaw is about like this, so the animal would have gone not all the way to the door, but it would have made a good try at it. These things, we found that jaw down around Interlock. If you can imagine something swaddling up on the beach down there and taking a look at you with a jaw like that, it would be a bit of a surprise. 100 million, 110 million years ago, it lived down there. It was very crocodile-like. It survived much longer here in Australia, in these southern latitudes, than it did anywhere else in the world. It was a relic, a survivor. It's sort of like the platypus and the echidna surviving well beyond their time elsewhere on Australia. 100 million years ago, Australia was acting as this kind of refuge as well, because it was an isolated part of this old Gondwana continent. That's what the more complete skeleton of one of these labyrinthodons looks like. Now, another and final reason that we are continuing to persist on these localities is that they are at a time, the age is at a time when the world's climate was changing rather dramatically from what we call, keep in mind that we're working right here at we're in the early part of the Cretaceous, going towards the end. This is the famous Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary where the dinosaurs, or most of them, become extinct. We're working in this time, and you can see that we're in a greenhouse world at that time, right after the animals lived at Dinosaur Cove. The Earth, the world, everything began to cool, and we moved in towards the icehouse climate that we have now. So it's very interesting for us to understand what was going on at that time at Dinosaur Cove. And I guess if you're looking for practical applications of what we do, which is not what we're looking at all, but if you're looking at a practical application, trying to understand how fast, how, when, what animals were affected, what plants were affected, by looking at the changes in that environment through time and the animals and the biota, it might be on some accountant's ledger sheet, it might be worthwhile doing that, because you might be able to use the information for predicting what is going to happen in the future. I might point out at that stage that those are the kinds of deductions that come from scientific research that might not look like they have any kind of practical application at the time people are doing them, but in fact they might have very firm practical application. Now, I'm getting very close, so I won't keep you much longer. We've expanded this program because, as you saw on the map before, Australia was connected to Antarctica, and Antarctica likewise to South America at the time that our dinosaurs were living. So we want to know more about what is happening on other parts of Gondwana. This program came about fortuitously because funding is drying up. It's very difficult to get funding other than from private enterprise at the moment to continue such basic research as we're doing down in Dinosaur Cove. And in fact, next year, Tom and I have decided that with the ARC being what it is, we're going to go on a lecture tour in America to make enough money to keep our research program going. The fortuitousness of the South American program came about because we went to a conference, and a man who was building a new museum in Patagonia wanted some foreign advisors to come in and help at that museum. And we said we'd be glad to. So we are now going in as foreign advisors to that museum and having at least our ways paid to the museum to do that, to help them open up fossil fields in South America that are just about the same age as what we have. For us, it's an opportunity, a research opportunity that's fantastic. It's good for our students, and we're working in an absolutely wonderful country. It's very simple to do work here. This is one of the places that we stayed. This is one of the people who helped us. There are a number of these people who know the land extremely well, and they are more than happy to have you on their land to look at their fossils and to talk to them. And the country that we're working in is the exposures in this country. This is one of the problems in Australia. The exposures of rocks of the right age are just so few and far between, but in South America, in Patagonia, they go on forever. The final thing that I want to talk about takes us to yet another part of the world, and I will pretty much end on this, because this is really going on a long time. Funding has always been a bit of a problem, and it's getting to be more and more of a problem. And I want to look at two places that I've been that we have generated a fair bit of funding just using our wits. China was an area that I went into when it was still the Iron Curtain was still up. I went into China in the late part of 1979. And the express purpose of that, I was sent by the Australian Academy of Science and was invited by the Academia Sinica to come and get an evaluation of what the state of vertebrate paleontology was in that country. The Cultural Revolution had just come to an end, sort of. There were still lots of things going on in China that made me think it hadn't come to an end. Going across the border into China at that time was fairly complicated, and this is my first vision of going across from the Hong Kong side. I went on the train at Lo Wu and went across, and we suddenly went from a society that was very like our society to something that was very, very different to what I was used to. Everyone still wore the uniform. I went to Beijing with the express purpose of seeing what was going on at the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Palaeontology, but also to get out in the field and to evaluate the possibility of developing joint field research with many people. I guess really with the idea in mind, not only of my own research, but I knew that many of my colleagues in China were having a very, very hard time doing anything. They didn't have much money, and we were trying to figure out ways of helping out with that. Of course, it would be useful to us, but I think my main aim was just seeing Chinese vertebrate paleontology get rolling again. We worked in about 4 different areas in China. We were always greeted in the standard way, and we saw in many museums around, and I was the only one in China, wonderful collections, absolutely superb collections that most people hadn't seen in a while. And one area that we worked in southern China, which now is under rice cultivation, from the point of view of the paleontologists, this is tragic, but from the point of view of the population there, it was necessary. But these were beds that were about the same age as the ones that we're working on here in Victoria. There were dinosaur eggs coming out by the load there, and so we evaluated that area, and not too much longer after that, a group from Germany went in and were able to begin work there. Because of my going in there with the Chinese. They got me in to use as a wedge to allow other foreign people to work with the Chinese. Now, what came of that visit was a lot. And it really proved to me that this is a way that one has to think if you're going to fund some of this basic research. It's not the way I would choose to do it, but it's the way we've done it in a couple of cases. One with the Chinese, due to work by my husband and myself and people that I met when I was in China. We put together a big Chinese dinosaur exhibition which traveled around Australia. More than 500,000 people saw it when it came here in 1982, and that generated funds, and it brought people here from China to work with technicians here. It was a great success. The other thing that came out of that trip was when I was in China, I realized that there was so much literature in vertebrate paleontology in Chinese that we didn't have access to. It was very expensive to hire people to do that. So I put in a proposal to the Australian Academy to put together a database on Chinese technical terms for vertebrate paleontology, but as it turned out, it is much broader than that. It has lots of medical terms, lots of terms, because vertebrate paleontology is such a hybrid of biology and geology and lots of other things. There are terms in there that will apply and are being used by people in many different fields. We collected about 30,000 terms, and I had a graduate student go back to Nanjing. She collected another similar amount. Those are now on computer database, and that dictionary came out. What we found out that was most interesting, though, this was for us Uyghur, us non-Chinese speakers, was that during the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese had been so separated in the different institutes that they had developed different terminologies in Nanjing and in Beijing, and they were using our dictionaries to find synonymies between terms that they didn't know the synonymies between, which was just a wonderful thing to understand. And the other thing that I was most interested in that first visit to China was getting into the archival material that was there. There were reams and reams and reams of, well, not reams, but rolls and rolls and rolls of old film there that had never been registered, no one had labeled, and it was a film that was deteriorating. So we got a lot of that together and preserved it, and it is now here at the Queen Victoria Museum and preserved there. So that was interesting while I was there. The next trip that we had was to Russia. And I really will want to make this fairly short. Started out in Japan. This isn't Russia at all. It started out in Japan. Again, it turned into a fundraising exercise, which was a most interesting thing to me because it was very different than with China. I was at a conference. Scientists go to conferences. They're good things to do. I can only really get to about one every year, maybe one every 2 years because of all sorts of things. But this one was the International Geological Congress in Kyoto in 1982. And at that conference, I got hijacked and went up to Tokyo to look at an exhibition that was there of Russian dinosaurs, Russian and Mongolian dinosaurs, and it was so fabulous. I said to myself, this has got to come to Australia. It is just so beautiful. I've never seen anything like this. It made the Chinese dinosaur exhibition pale in comparison. So I said, fine, I'll go back to the conference in Kyoto and I'll look up the guy who's in charge of the Palaeontological Institute in Moscow and ask him if we can have it. So I did. That's him. That's Alexei Rozanov. He was a nice guy. We had a cup of coffee and he says, oh yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Why don't we try to do it? He told me later that when he talked to me at that conference, he said, yeah, there's this chance of a snowflake of this happening. Anyway, we didn't hear anything from Alexei for about, well, this was August. We didn't hear anything until December. Sometime in December, I got this letter from Alexei Rozanov, and he said, would you like to come to Russia to negotiate the contract? I said, of course, I'll be glad to come to do that. But then I immediately thought, what does this mean? Where am I going to get the money to bring tons and tons of dinosaurs, 50 boxes of dinosaurs to Australia? Where am I going to get the money to make the panels and write the catalog, put the catalog together and get this up? Where am I going to get the venues to get this exhibition on the road? People have got to have it. I mean, I can't just put it up in a barn. So I fortunately met a lady by the name of Kay Hamilton, who was introduced to me by my husband because she had done some fundraising for him. And we got together and we thought, well, why don't we just put a proposal together and go down and see if we can convince someone that this really ought to be done. And we chuffed off down to Channel 7 because we thought they might help us out. And we got down to Channel 7 and talked to some people there, and they said, that sounds like a good idea. And then we found out about 5 minutes later, the people we've been talking to at Channel 7 had picked up a phone and called Neil Ruff, who is one of the directors at Hamilton Ruff, a marketing agency, and he said to them, and I'm not sure exactly what the words were, he said to them, I have a couple of these crazy ladies that came into my office and they've got a really great idea, but they don't have any money. So we went to see Neil. We got in touch with Neil, and we went to see Neil and his crew, and we started putting our heads together. Now, I've never worked with publicists or fundraisers or accounting or public relations agencies or anything before in my life, and I didn't know what they were like, and they didn't know what I was like. But we liked each other. We liked each other a lot, and we trusted each other, and that's exactly what the Russians and we had. It's something scientists have generally with one another, the trust between them. That's why the Russians had been willing to let us have this material without even blinking an eye, even though, of course, they needed the foreign currency, but they had had some very hard dealings with other groups that had taken their material on board. So we got together, and we managed to get into see some people at Qantas, and Qantas came to our aid and gave us 40 airline tickets and gave us the money and the space on the planes to move the dinosaurs. My only really great shock was when I got a fax from one of the cargo people in Qantas saying, the dinosaurs are in Frankfurt, and I thought, they aren't insured. Well, how did the dinosaurs get from Moscow to Frankfurt? And it was on the move, and we had been able, but Kay Hamilton, Hamilton Ruff crew, and myself had been able to cobble together enough funds from Qantas, from ICI, from Bostik, from Channel 7, etc., to make this exhibition work. Now, I just finished that exhibition, which comes from the Palaeontological Institute, included, as many of you saw when it was here at Monash, some of the most beautiful material of the Protoceratops, the Ceratopsian. This is the museum in Moscow, which you can see has many of these skeletons came with that exhibition. And I would point out that this museum in Moscow is a wonderful museum in that it combines art and science. It has some wonderful bas-reliefs, some wonderful paintings, wonderful sculptures, wonderful ironwork. Everything in that museum just speaks to me of brilliance. It's just too bad we don't have a little bit more of that in some of ours. Some of the beautiful skeletons that came from that exhibition, a mammal-like reptile, Lystrosaurus, which is very dear and near to paleontologists. All of that came with it. We got it here, it went around Australia, 1 million people saw it in this country. It made money for museums, it made money, it kept the Russian Institute that we were working with, 250 people in jobs since 1993. It also had a lot of job start programs in Tasmania where we're doing casts of all of this material. Some of the material up here on the front desk is casts of that material. The Russians gave us permission to make casts of everything in that exhibition. And although these are just exhibition quality casts, we have molds from which they were poured that are museum quality casts. So that material has all been done, and it's provided jobs for many. I think the last time I counted was about 21 young people under the age of 22 that were out of work and on the street. So this has done a lot, and it's been done simply by scientists working with other people to put this together. It has had no government funding whatsoever, and it's gone on its own. Now, I want to try just do this again before we finish. I have a couple of other things to show you, then I shall release you from the grip of the paleontologist here. This is going to come next. Just a tick. Got to get this right. I want to say this first, and then I will do 2 other short videos, and that will be over. These are the points I would like to make. I think that intellectual curiosity should be subsidized from the moment a child is born until the time they die, and hopefully they'll be 95 or 100. And I don't think intellectual curiosity should somehow be branded as something that's just within a university or a high school. Intellectual curiosity is the precious possession of everybody, I think, and it should be subsidized in any way and in any form that we can. To make fun of that and to somehow debase that is missing the point entirely. People should be nurtured to follow their dreams, and no matter whether you may think, as far as I'm concerned, whether you think that somebody's not going to be able to reach that, give them a try. Let them really try, and if it doesn't, give them the strength to try something else. I don't think, and although it is killing a number of us who still strive for that quality, I don't think quality should be compromised. Somehow it needs to be kept there, or somehow it all just becomes not worth doing. And I think George Washington was right. Now I'm going to show you just a couple of things here, and then we will finish. One thing we're doing here at Monash, and I have the architectural plans up here, is trying to start well, no, we're not trying to start a science center. We have started a science center, and we are now fundraising for a building. We're about halfway there. A building to be put up on the corner of Wellington and Blackburn Roads that will have displays, will have teaching areas for primary and secondary students. We hope we'll have an IMAX and a planetarium associated with it, and we'll definitely abide by those principles that I have mentioned on the last slide. We want it to not only make people really interested and excited by science, but it to have hard science in it so that they're not just told science is wonderful, but told why it's wonderful and what's wonderful about it, to get kids and the general public involved in all of that. And the final thing I would like to do is, this movie was my favorite of all times. The hero in this movie says it all. We should have some sound.
In all the hubbub of noise and excitement, there were 2 figures who stood silent and still, side by side. The man who in his life had uttered fewer words than any of them knew exactly what to say. That little pig. That'll do.
professors show people like that. That'll do, little professor. How do I do the lights, Professor? Are there any questions? A bit hard after that, I suppose.
I'd like to ask one question. You're talking about the dead horse.
Yes, sir.
Why don't you ever see dead birds? They must die. You never see them.
I've seen a few. Yeah, out in Central Australia, I've seen dried up carcasses of them, but I think their bones are very, very hollow, and things tend to eat them, whereas horses' bones are a little bit more solid, and it really takes something. The larger skeletons will often be there, and mammal skeletons will more often be there than birds. Birds tend to get et, and since they're fragile, they tend to get crunched up. That's a simple explanation. There's more complicated ones. Yes, Joe. Oh no. Am I? I can only think of a couple. One of them was when I took my first job at Texas Tech. I found out that when I left there later on that I was getting $3,000 less than my male counterparts when I went to work there. But of course that now you could do something about it. And the other time was being excluded from an Antarctic excavation before, when there were guys that were less qualified to go on it. But it was an American expedition. If I'd been going with the Australians or the New Zealanders, it wouldn't have been a problem. I remember that year, Tom went on that expedition, and they had some problem in the New Zealand base. There was a female doctor went down, and she was going to be the only one on the base, and the guy that was in charge of it, he just says, well, you're an honorary male. I don't care. Come on. It's fine. So the Australians and the New Zealanders didn't have any problem with it. The American Navy did, because the Navy was. So that's about the only two times I can think of. Really, I've not had a lot. You've all been very patient.
I don't see much fidgeting there. You will be able to talk to Pat in a more intimate way over the refreshments, which I understand are available. The Dean of Science would like me to say, I'm sure, that palaeontology is not the only exciting science. And we will have other distinguished lectures, inaugural lectures from other distinguished Monash professors. But Pat, we can only thank you for setting a standard which we hope the others will achieve. In fact, we'll look at their qualifications for this before we appoint them. Thank you very much, Pat. Please join us for refreshments.